The steel tore at 11 minutes past midnight, and the sound was not an explosion in the way that word is usually used. The steel tore at 11 minutes past midnight, and the sound was not an explosion in the way that word is usually used. It was a compression event, a sudden and violent reorganization of the space between the hull and the water that the hull was designed to separate, a sound that traveled through the metal of the ship and through the water and through any body in contact with either before the brain had time to identify what it was hearing as the thing that ended everything. The cold came immediately after, the Atlantic at that latitude in November being the specific temperature that removes consciousness from an unprotected body in minutes. He was in the water before he understood how he had gotten into the water. The ship was already below the surface before he understood what had happened to the ship. And then there was the ocean, and there was the darkness, and there was the silence of a place that had just absorbed a catastrophe and resumed its operations as if the catastrophe were no different from any other event that the Atlantic had processed in the 4 billion years before human beings began crossing it. This is The Human Limit. I am your host. If you want to understand what 133 days alone on a raft in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean does to the biological and psychological architecture of a human being, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the like button, because what I am about to describe is not a survival story in the conventional sense. It is a case study in the metamorphosis of a human mind, in the specific and irreversible transformation that occurs when the ocean removes every external reference point that civilization uses to define what a person is, and leaves only what was there before civilization began its work. His name was Poon Lim. He was 24 years old, a Chinese sailor serving as second steward on the British merchant vessel SS Ben Lomond, torpedoed by a German U-boat in the South Atlantic on November 23, 1942. Of the crew of 55 men, he was the only survivor. He found the raft approximately 2 hours after the ship went down, pulled himself onto it in the specific, desperate way that a person pulls themselves onto a surface when the alternative to being on the surface is being in the water, and he lay on it and breathed. The raft was approximately 2.5 meters square. It was equipped with emergency supplies: tinned biscuits, a small amount of fresh water, a few flares, a flashlight, a bag of sugar. The people who had stocked the raft had calculated a survival time of approximately 4 weeks, which is a reasonable calculation for a rescue scenario in which the rescue arrives within the expected window. The rescue did not arrive within the expected window. The rescue did not arrive within any window that the people who stocked the raft had calculated for. The first weeks were the weeks of hope, which is the specific category of suffering that comes before the category of despair, and which is in certain ways harder to describe because hope requires constant maintenance, and the maintenance of hope in conditions that do not support it is its own form of exhaustion. He rationed the water. He rationed the food. He watched the horizon with the attention of someone who believes that what they are watching for will appear, that the watching itself is a form of productive action, that the accumulation of hours of watching adds up to something. The ships that passed did not stop. He saw them, not hallucinations, not wishes, actual vessels, visible on the horizon, close enough that the identification of them as ships rather than as features of the ocean was reliable. He fired his flares. He signaled with his flashlight. The ships did not alter course. The reasons why ships on the South Atlantic convoy routes in 1942 did not stop for distress signals are documented and had to do with submarine activity and the specific calculus of risk that wartime maritime operations required. The reasons did not matter to him in the way that reasons do not matter to a person watching the thing they need to survive disappear below the horizon. The food ran out in the 5th week. The water ran out the same week. Here is where the story stops being a story about a man waiting to be rescued and becomes a story about a man deciding not to die. The seabirds that rested on the raft were the first resource. He caught them with his hands, which required a quality of stillness and patience that the hunger and the dehydration were both simultaneously demanding and consuming, the specific paradox of hunting, when the energy cost of the hunt exceeds what the hunt can recover. He learned the patience by doing it, by failing repeatedly, and by the failure teaching him the adjustment that success required. The neck of the bird was the thing. Not a violent motion, nothing that would startle the bird before contact was established. A slow hand, and then a fast hand, and then the neck, and then silence. He drank the blood first, before anything else. He understood at some level of practicality that had overtaken the level of preference, that the blood was the most immediately useful product of the bird, containing fluid and salt in a ratio his dehydrated body could use, and he drank it. He ate the flesh. He used the body of the bird as bait for fish, the blood entering the water and attracting smaller fish that he caught with hooks he had improvised from wire in the raft's construction. The hooks were adequate for small fish. They were not adequate for what was under the raft at night. The sharks that circulated below the raft were present from early in the drift, attracted by the biological material that a raft in open ocean produces, by the blood of the birds he was processing, by whatever signals his own body was producing into the water, through the small cuts and abrasions that the salt and the sun and the raft's surface had produced in his skin. He knew they were there by the sound they made against the wood, the specific irregular contact of a large body moving close to a surface and occasionally making contact with it, a sound that became familiar in the way that a recurring threat becomes familiar, which is not comfortable but is processed differently than the first time. He had been on the raft for approximately 3 months when the thirst reached a level that the fish blood and bird blood were no longer managing. The specific threshold of dehydration at which the body begins to prioritize fluid acquisition over every other consideration is documented, and he had crossed it. He was not thinking about the sharks in the way that he had been thinking about them as threats to be avoided. He was thinking about them as fluid contained in a body, and the body happened to be in the water below the raft. He made a hook from a nail he had worked loose from the raft's construction over several days. A nail bent into a curve, baited with a piece of bird, attached to a length of cord. He lowered it into the water on the side of the raft that the current pushed toward, which was the information about current that he had accumulated from weeks of watching how the raft moved in relation to the swells. If the sheer desperation of drinking the blood of a monster to stay alive is already chilling your bones, leave a like and subscribe to The Human Limit so we can continue testing human limits. Because what happened when the hook found what it was looking for is the part that I want you to understand fully. And understanding it fully requires that you set aside the word desperate and replace it with the word necessary. Because necessary is what it was, and desperate does not capture the precision of the decision. The shark that took the hook was small by open ocean standards, perhaps 1.5 meters, which is small only in relative terms. When he pulled it onto the raft, it was not cooperative. It moved in the specific way that a cartilaginous predator moves when it is removed from its medium, which is all the ways available to it simultaneously. The tail and the body and the jaw in constant motion, the jaw being the part with the most immediate consequences for a barefoot man on a small wooden surface. He had one advantage. The shark was in its wrong medium, and he was in his correct one. He used the water jug, a metal container that had been part of the original raft supplies, and that he had kept as a container even after its contents were gone, because a metal container on a raft has uses beyond its original function. He brought it down on the shark's head with the specific accuracy of someone who had been practicing accuracy in everything for 3 months, because accuracy was what distinguished a calorie gained from a calorie spent. The shark stopped moving. He cut it open with a piece of metal he had sharpened against the raft's edge over the preceding weeks. The improvised blade not clean, but functional, and the functional was what mattered. The liver was the target. The liver of a shark contains squalene, a compound that the body can process for hydration in ways that seawater cannot be processed. And he knew this not from biochemistry, but from the practical knowledge of someone who had been living from the ocean long enough to observe what the consumption of different parts of different animals did to his body, and to learn from the observation. He drank from the liver directly. The blood first, the specific warm metallic fluid that a recently killed animal produces from its cut surfaces, and then the liver, the specific organ whose content provided what 3 months of equatorial dehydration had taken. He He has described this in the accounts that were recorded after his rescue, and the descriptions are flat in the specific way that the accounts of people who have done necessary things are flat, without the dramatic framing that the act would carry if it had been hypothetical rather than actual. He ate the flesh of the shark over the following days, drying some of it on the raft's edge in the equatorial sun, an improvised preservation technique that extended the resource beyond a single day's consumption. He used the spine and the skin for other purposes. He used everything because he was 3 months into the specific education that the open ocean provides about the relationship between resource and waste, and had reached the point where waste was not a category that his operating mind had access to. The storms came in the later weeks of the drift. The South Atlantic in that season produces weather systems that build quickly and without the coastal reference points that allow anticipation, and the raft had no protection from them. The same water that had been the constraint for months became, during the storms, something he could collect, running down the surfaces of the raft into whatever containers he had managed to maintain, and he collected every drop with the specific, focused attention that months of scarcity had built into his motor habits. He stopped counting days at some point in the 3rd month. This is the detail that I find most significant about the psychological transformation the drift produced. More significant than the shark, more significant than the birds or the improvised hooks. Not the inability to count, which would be a cognitive symptom, the decision not to. He reports, in the accounts that were recorded after his rescue, that the counting stopped because the counting had been serving the function of measuring proximity to rescue, and rescue had ceased to be a variable in his operational thinking. He was not waiting to be rescued. He had moved into a mode of existence that did not include waiting as a category, because waiting implies an endpoint, and he had stopped being oriented toward endpoints. He was surviving. Not toward anything, simply surviving, in the way that organisms survive, as a continuous present tense process, rather than a means toward a future state. This is the transformation. This is the thing that makes the 133 days medically remarkable. Beyond the physical endurance, beyond the improvised tools and the shark blood and the dried fish, the human mind is built around futurity, around the projection of the self into a future state, and the orientation of present behavior toward that future state. Remove the future state, and the mind does not simply continue operating without it. It reorganizes around the present in a way that is not a diminishment but a different mode, one that human beings have the capacity for and almost never access because the structures of civilization continuously provide future states to orient toward. The ocean removed those structures. What remained was not less than a person. It was a different configuration of a person, one that had access to capabilities that the civilized configuration suppresses because civilization does not require them and sometimes actively discourages them. The patience to catch a bird with bare hands. The willingness to kill a shark in close quarters on a small wooden surface. The ability to process the consumption of raw blood as resource acquisition rather than as violation. These are not things that Hugh Glass or Poon Lim or any of the people whose stories this channel carries developed because they were extraordinary. They are things that every human being carries at a depth that ordinary life never reaches. The ocean reached it. He was found on April 5, 1943, by Brazilian fishermen who saw something on the water that they could not initially identify as a person. He had been on the raft for 133 days. He was alive, which the doctors who examined him after his rescue described in terms that I think tell you everything about what those 133 days had produced. He was malnourished but functional. He was dehydrated but conscious. He had sores on his body from prolonged salt and sun exposure that required treatment. He was approximately 6 kilograms lighter than he had been when the Ben Lomond went down. 6 kilograms. In 133 days of open ocean survival, with no food or water from external sources for the final 2/3 of the drift, he had lost 6 kilograms. The doctors noted this. The records note their noting of it. What the records do not capture is what it cost to produce that number, what the organization of the body and the mind that 133 days of the Atlantic produced looks like from the inside of the person it was organized in. He was awarded the British Empire Medal. He was the first Chinese national to receive it. He later emigrated and lived for decades, dying in 1991 at the age of 72. He did not, by the accounts of people who knew him, speak often about the raft. When he did speak about it, the accounts suggest that what he described was not the ordeal, but the specific quality of the experience that the ordeal produced, the clarity of a life reduced to its essential operations, the absence of the noise that civilization generates around the question of what a person is and what a person is for. The ocean had answered that question in its own way. That is the human limit. Subscribe to this channel, leave a comment. Tell me at what point you think your mind would have reorganized, which day you think you would have stopped counting, what you think the specific quality of presence in the present tense that the raft produced would feel like from the inside. I read every single comment. I will be back with another anomaly from the place where the human being turns out to be something different and something more than the civilization that produced it has led us to believe. The Atlantic is still there. The coordinates where the Ben Lomond went down are navigable. Ships cross them regularly, the same category of ships that crossed the horizon while he watched from the raft, and the ocean below them is the same ocean that held a raft for 133 days and returned what was on the raft to the world changed but intact. The ocean did not intend this. The ocean does not intend anything. It simply continues, as it always has, doing what it does. And what it does is occasionally reveal what human beings are when everything else is taken away. What it revealed was sufficient.